On August 10th, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television to make an announcement that would reshape the global economy. He declared that the United States was temporarily suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold. Foreign governments would no longer be able to exchange their dollars for gold at the Federal Reserve. It was presented as a defensive measure to protect America from foreign speculators. Nixon spoke of economic warfare being waged against the United States. He promised the suspension would be brief, just long enough to stabilize the system. But everyone watching who understood finance knew the truth. This wasn't temporary. This was the end of the Bretton Woods system. This was America cutting the last link between money and reality. And while it seemed like a moment of American power, a unilateral decision that forced the world to accept American terms, it was actually the moment America set a trap for itself. A trap that would take 50 years to fully close, but one that is now tightening around the throat of the American economy. This is the story of how America's greatest financial victory became its greatest vulnerability, how the exorbitant privilege became an unbearable burden, and how the choices made in 1971 have created a situation that has no good way out. To understand the trap, you have to understand what America gained in 1971 and what it gave up. Under the Bretton Woods system, created in 1944, the dollar was as good as gold because it was backed by gold. Foreign governments could redeem their dollars at $35 per ounce. This discipline constrained American policy. If the U.S. ran large budget deficits or printed too much money, foreign governments would demand gold and the reserves would drain. This is exactly what was happening in the 1960s. America was fighting the Vietnam War and funding the Great Society programs simultaneously. The deficits were exploding. France and other countries were converting their dollars into gold, and Fort Knox was being emptied. By 1971, the United States held less than 9,000 tons of gold, down from over 20,000 tons in 1950. At the rate gold was leaving, the vaults would be empty within a few years. Nixon faced a choice. He could raise taxes, cut spending, and end the war to stop the gold drain. Or he could simply refuse to honor America's commitments. He chose the latter. And in doing so, he removed the only constraint on American money creation. After 1971, the dollar was backed by nothing except trust in the United States government. There was no limit to how many dollars could be printed. There was no penalty for running deficits. There was no external discipline at all. At first, this seemed like liberation. America could now pursue any policy it wanted without worrying about gold reserves. It could run deficits to finance social programs. It could maintain a massive military without raising taxes. It could fight wars without economic sacrifice at home. The rest of the world would have to accept dollars because there was no alternative. The global trading system was built around the dollar. Every commodity from oil to wheat was priced in dollars. Every central bank held dollars as reserves. The entire infrastructure of international finance ran through New York. Switching to a different system would have been impossibly disruptive, so the world kept using dollars, even though they were no longer redeemable for gold. And America exploited this. Throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, America ran persistent trade deficits. It imported more than it exported, consuming more than it produced. In a normal country, this would be unsustainable. The currency would fall, imports would become expensive, and the country would be forced to balance its trade. But America was different. Because the world needed dollars for trade and reserves, there was constant demand for dollars regardless of America's trade balance. Foreign countries would sell goods to America and receive dollars in payment. Then they would take those dollars and invest them back into American assets. Treasury bonds, stocks, real estate. The dollars flowed out to buy imports and flowed back in as investment. It was a closed loop that seemed to work perfectly. This circular flow allowed America to live beyond its means for decades. American consumers bought cheap goods from China, Japan, and Europe. American corporations moved their factories overseas to take advantage of lower wages. American workers lost their jobs, but they could buy cheaper products at Walmart. The hollowing out of American manufacturing was sold as inevitable as the natural evolution toward a service economy. But what was really happening was that America was trading its industrial capacity for consumption, trading its ability to produce for the ability to buy. And it could only do this because the world needed dollars. The trap was being set, but no one noticed because everyone was getting what they wanted. American consumers got cheap goods. Foreign manufacturers got access to the American market. Foreign governments got dollar reserves. And the American government got to run deficits without consequences. It seemed like a perfect arrangement, but it was built on a fragile foundation. It required the rest of the world to keep accepting dollars, keep buying treasury bonds, and keep playing by American rules. As long as that continued, the system worked. But what would happen if the world stopped cooperating? The first crack in the foundation appeared in the 2000s. China, which had become the workshop of the world, was accumulating massive dollar reserves. By 2008, China held over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. They had lent this money to America by running trade surpluses, selling more to America than they bought. But Chinese officials started asking uncomfortable questions. Why should China produce real goods and receive paper dollars in return? Why should Chinese workers labor in factories so that Americans can consume? Why should China lend money to a country that seems to have no intention of ever paying it back? The Chinese began to see the relationship as exploitative. They were trapped in what economists call the dollar trap. They couldn't dump their treasury bonds because it would crash the value of their remaining holdings. They couldn't stop accumulating dollars because their export-driven economy depended on selling to America. And they could unspend their dollars on anything except American assets because that's what the system was designed to do. China was a creditor with no power, lending money to a debtor who controlled the currency. It was a frustrating position, and China began looking for ways out. Then came 2008, and the financial crisis revealed just how reckless America had become. American banks had been making predatory loans, bundling them into toxic securities, and selling them around the world. When the housing bubble burst, the entire global financial system nearly collapsed. And how did America respond? The Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars to bail out the banks. The government ran trillion-dollar deficits to stimulate the economy. There was no austerity, no sacrifice, no consequence for the people who had caused the crisis. America simply printed money and forced the world to absorb the inflation. Foreign holders of dollars watched as the value of their reserves was quietly eroded. They had lent real goods and labor to America, and America was repaying them with depreciated paper. The implicit deal of the dollar system that America would maintain the value and stability of the currency was being broken, but there was nothing they could do. The dollar was still the only game in town. The infrastructure, the markets, the pricing systems, everything still ran on dollars. Switching away would be too costly and too disruptive. So they grumbled and continued to participate in the system. But trust was damaged. And trust, once lost, is hard to restore. The second crack appeared when America began weaponizing the dollar. The power to exclude countries from the dollar system is one of the most potent weapons in the American arsenal. When the U.S. freezes a country's assets or cuts them off from SWIFT, it can cripple their economy without firing a shot. This weapon was used against Iran to force compliance on the nuclear program. It was used against North Korea to punish their weapons tests. It was used against Venezuela to undermine their government. And in 2022, it was used against Russia on a massive scale. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves. They cut Russian banks off from SWIFT. They seized the assets of Russian oligarchs. It was the most aggressive use of financial warfare in history, and it worked. The Russian economy was devastated, but the rest of the world was watching. Countries from China to India to Saudi Arabia to Brazil saw what happened to Russia and drew a conclusion. Dollar reserves are not safe. If you anger Washington, your money can be taken. Your economy can be destroyed. Your sovereignty can be violated. This was a turning point. The dollar had always been seen as neutral, as a store of value that transcended politics. But now it was clearly a weapon, a tool of American foreign policy, and this changed the calculation for every country. Here's where the trap becomes visible. America's power depends on the world using dollars, but the world is increasingly afraid to hold dollars because they can be weaponized. This creates a dilemma. If America stops weaponizing the dollar, it loses one of its most effective foreign policy tools. But if it continues weaponizing the dollar, more countries will seek alternatives, which undermines the dollar's dominance, which is the foundation of American power. It's a classic trap. The very thing that makes America powerful, the dollar's dominance, is being eroded, by the way. America uses that power. Every sanction, every asset freeze, every financial attack pushes more countries to build alternatives. China is building SIPs to replace SWIFT. The BRICS nations are discussing a new reserve currency. Countries are signing bilateral trade agreements to bypass the dollar. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. The dollar's share of global reserves is declining. These are all direct responses to the weaponization of the dollar. America is destroying the foundation of its own power, but the trap goes deeper. America's ability to run trade deficits and print money depends on foreign countries buying treasury bonds. As long as China, Japan, and Europe are willing to lend money to the US government by buying bonds, America can run deficits indefinitely. But what happens when they stop? What happens when they decide that holding treasury bonds is too risky, that the return doesn't justify the political risk, that they'd rather invest in their own countries or in alternative assets? This is already starting to happen. China has been slowly reducing its holdings of treasury bonds. In 2013, China held over 1.3 trillion in treasuries. By 2023, it was down to under 850 billion. Japan, the other major holder, is also selling because they need the dollars to defend their own currency. The European Central Bank is reducing its dollar reserves. The buyers are disappearing. And this creates a crisis for America. The US government is running deficits of over $1 trillion per year. Someone has to buy that debt. If foreign buyers step back, who fills the gap? The only option is the Federal Reserve. The Fed has to print money to buy the treasury bonds that foreigners no longer want. But printing money causes inflation. And inflation makes the debt problem worse because it erodes the value of existing bonds, making future buyers even more reluctant. It's a death spiral. America is now trapped between two impossible choices. It can raise interest rates to attract foreign buyers, but high interest rates make the debt unsustainable because the government has to pay more. Interest on $34 trillion of debt. Just 1 percentage point increase in interest rates adds hundreds of billions to the annual deficit. Or America can keep interest rates low and print money to buy its own debt, but that causes inflation and destroys the purchasing power of the dollar, which pushes foreign holders to dump their bonds faster. Either choice leads to disaster. High rates cause a debt crisis. Low rates cause an inflation crisis. This is the trap, and there's no easy way out. The trap was set in 1971 when America abandoned gold and decided to run the global financial system on pure fiat currency. For 50 years, it worked brilliantly. America got to print money and buy real goods. It got to run deficits without consequences. It got to maintain a military empire without taxing its citizens. It got to live far beyond its means, but that arrangement depended on the rest of the world's cooperation. It depended on trust. It depended on there being no alternative. All three of those conditions are now breaking down. The world is losing trust in American institutions. The 2008 crisis showed that American banks are reckless. The political dysfunction shows that the American government is incapable of fiscal discipline. The debt levels showed that America has no intention of ever balancing its budget. The weaponization of the dollar shows that America will use financial power for political ends. Why would any rational country want to keep lending money to America under these conditions? And yet, they have to, because the alternative is worse. If they stop buying treasury bonds, the dollar collapses, which destroys the value of their existing holdings. They're trapped in the same system, but they're looking for exits, and slowly, carefully, they're building them. The alternatives are emerging. Not one big alternative that replaces the dollar overnight, but many small alternatives that chip away at dollar dominance. Currency swaps that bypass the dollar, payment systems that avoid SWIFT, trade agreements denominated in local currencies, gold purchases to diversify reserves. Each one reduces dollar usage by a small amount, but they're adding up, and the trend is accelerating. Every time America uses sanctions, the trend accelerates. Every time the Fed prints money, the trend accelerates. Every time the government runs another $1 trillion deficit, the trend accelerates. The tragedy is that this trap was avoidable. If America had maintained fiscal discipline, if it had kept its industrial base strong, if it had used the dollar's privilege responsibly, the system could have lasted indefinitely. But America didn't do any of those things. It treated the exorbitant privilege as a permanent entitlement rather than a temporary advantage. It hollowed out its manufacturing. It ran endless deficits. It printed money recklessly. It weaponized the currency. And now it's facing the consequences. The dollar will not collapse overnight. There will be no single moment of crisis. Instead, there will be a slow, grinding decline. The dollar's share of reserves will keep falling. More trade will be conducted in other currencies. The US will find it harder and harder to finance its deficits. Interest rates will have to rise to attract buyers. The debt burden will grow heavier. The trade deficits will start to matter. The standard of living will decline. America will gradually lose the ability to live beyond its means. It will have to start producing what it consumes. It will have to start balancing its budget. It will have to start making hard choices. This adjustment will be painful, made worse by the fact that Americans have grown accustomed to the privileges of empire. They expect cheap imports. They expect low taxes and high government spending. They expect to consume without producing. These expectations are incompatible with reality, but changing them will require a level of honesty and sacrifice that the political system seems incapable of delivering. The politicians in Washington still talk as if dollar dominance is permanent, as if America can run deficits forever, as if the rest of the world will keep financing American consumption indefinitely. They're living in a fantasy. The world has changed. The conditions that created dollar dominance no longer exist. America is no longer the dominant manufacturer. It's no longer the largest trading nation. It's no longer the most trusted financial center. It's no longer the unquestioned superpower. The dollar's dominance is a legacy of a world that no longer exists. And legacies don't last forever. The trap that America set for itself in 1971 is now closing. The freedom to print money without constraint has become a curse. The ability to run deficits without consequences has led to unsustainable debt. The weaponization of the dollar has destroyed trust. The trade deficits have destroyed the industrial base. All of the short-term benefits have created long-term costs that are now coming due. And the cruel irony is that the people who made these decisions, the politicians and central bankers of the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, they got to enjoy the benefits. They got cheap imports, low taxes, and global dominance. But the costs will be paid by the next generation, by people who had no say in the decisions, who inherited a system that's already broken. They will have to deal with the inflation, the debt, the declining living standards, and the loss of global influence. They will have to figure out how to rebuild an economy that was hollowed out for consumption. The trap is not a conspiracy. It's not the result of evil intent. It's the result of short-term thinking, of prioritizing immediate benefits over long-term consequences, of assuming that good fortune is permanent. Every empire in history has made the same mistake. They exploit their dominance to live beyond their means. They assume their power is eternal. They ignore the warning signs. And by the time they realize the trap they've set for themselves, it's too late to escape. America is following the same path. The trap is closing, and there's no easy way out. I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.